I grew up in this podunk town in Nebraska. And in the 18 years I lived there, only two significant things happened. The first thing, and probably the best thing, is that I was born. I know, you're all very welcome. But the second, and perhaps the worst thing that ever happened in our town, was when Kevin Meyer set his garage on fire. Or rather, maybe what Kevin did constituted the worst thing that never happened to our town. And if that doesn't make any sense, bear with me. All will become clear over the course of the next few paragraphs. So it was a Sunday night, and I was in my freshman year of high school at the time. So still, at that age when me and my friends would go out on our bikes for an evening. You know, good old, wholesome fun. We're just riding around when we see another kid from our class riding down the street at top speed. We stop, say, hey, and in between panting breaths, the kid's like, oh my god, guys. The Myers garage is on fire. Come look. We then hurtled down the street at full speed, following the kid from our class until we're faced with this raging inferno that used to be the Myers family garage. Only right as we get there, we're immediately told to keep back by the cops and firefighters on scene. We thought we were already at a safe distance. So we're kind of confused but did as we're told, only then we start hearing all these pops and bangs coming from the garage. And the firefighters trying to put the flames out suddenly ran for cover. I had no idea what was causing the little bangs. But if it was scaring the cops and the firefighters, then I figured I should have been scared of it too. I actually thought the Meyer house was about to explode or something, and so did my buddies. So we had no problem getting out of there quick, riding home and telling our parents about it. The next morning at school, all the kids were talking about the fire, mainly because Kevin Meyer hadn't showed up to any of his classes. Some kids were spreading rumors saying they'd seen the paramedics loading him up onto an ambulance, and he was so badly burned that he was just a smoldering husk. Others said that he and his parents had gone to live with relatives since the fire had made their house basically unlivable. Which is the story I believe, because I figured there'd be actual confirmation if anyone had died within the next morning. That was confirmation. News reports said that firefighters had recovered one body from the burned-out garage, while the surviving family members were staying with relatives and had asked the media to give them some space. So on that Tuesday, we knew someone had died. But we had no idea exactly who. The Myers had 3 generations living in that house. And Kevin was one of 4 kids. A bunch more rumors began swirling, and it was only the following day when our high school principal called us all in for a special assembly that we've actually got any concrete answers. I remember the whole school filing into the gymnasium where the county sheriff and a handful of deputies were all stood in front of the bleachers, each of them with a real serious look on their faces. Once we were all seated, the principal opened up by saying that the county sheriff had something important to talk to us about. And as he stepped forward and took his hat off, I swear you could have heard a pin drop. We knew it was going to be something about the Meyer family, but exactly what it was, I'd swear I'd never have guessed in a million years. I'm not about to pretend I can remember what the guy said word for word. This all happened almost 20 years ago now. But this is basically the gist of it. Folks, you've all heard about the fire over the fireplace. And I'm sure you've all heard about the tragic loss of life. Well, I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you, but your classmate Kevin was the one who passed. There was a kind of rolling gasp across the gym, and the sheriff paused for a second before continuing. Now, we're still trying to figure out how the fire started. So we're inviting anyone with any information on Kevin, please step forward. You don't have to do it now. You can call my office whenever you like, and we can have a more discreet conversation. Please. If you have anything to tell us about any strange or unusual behavior Kevin exhibited in the days before the fire, I implore you to step forward. That was the first clue we had that something was really wrong. I guess they wanted to handle the whole thing with kid gloves, and I can totally understand why they might want to shield us from what they already knew. The initial reaction was one of total shock and grief. Kids were horrified that one of their own had died in such a horrible way. But if the cops had told us what they really found in there, I don't think people would have been nearly as sad. More like angry. It took 2 more days for the truth to come out. And by that time, the town had decided to defer responsibility to our parents. There was a town meeting. And I remember that because my parents asked me to do my chores before they returned, and all they did was play Perfect Dark for like 2 hours. When they got home, I thought they'd be mad that I hadn't even put a dent into any of the stuff I had to do. But they weren't mad. They had these weird but sad, but intense looks on their faces. Exactly the same ones they had when my grandpa died. Suddenly, they sit me down in the TV room and ask how well I knew Kevin. I tell them not much, that I had Spanish class with him, but that we never talked. They then start asking me a bunch of other questions. If Kevin ever got mad at me, if I liked him, stuff like that. In the end, I just straight up told them it was obvious they knew something about Kevin, and that I'd rather they just told me that it was him taking his own life or something, because I was old enough to handle the truth. Turns out, I was not old enough to handle the truth. Kevin hadn't taken his own life. He'd accidentally blown himself up trying to make a bomb. Apparently, he wanted to test his method out by making a test model. But as he was putting it together, he somehow detonated the thing and made it enough of a bank to kill him before sending his garage on fire. At first, it did look like he might have just been a firebug. You know, like a pyromaniac. And he was just screwing around with an accelerant or something. That's why it took a few days for the cops to be sure of what happened. They had to go over the burned-out garage and go through Kevin's stuff to try and work out why he did it. The cops then found a journal Kevin had been keeping, one where he basically laid out his plan to build a bomb and put it under the church one Sunday morning while it was full of families. The cops wouldn't say exactly what the rest of the journal consisted of, only that it made for highly disturbing reading. And that there were several references to the Columbine massacre of the year before. Mom was crying by the end of the talk. And Dad was the most shaken up I'd ever seen him. That kid wanted to kill almost the entire town. And let me tell you, the VT hit the church around the upcoming Veterans Day service. He'd have killed like 90% of the people in our town, all in one binary blast. And the most aware of your God for an explanation was just the kid wanted to hurt people. Or he wasn't right. No one really bullied the kid or gave him a hard time, he was just crazy, I guess. But I also thank God that he wasn't smarter and that he didn't put a little more research in or take a little more care. Because if he had, he might have wiped our entire town right off the map. What I'm about to tell you is the darkest secrets I know. I'm from a little town in the Midwest, and in that town is a cute little chapel. In the back of that cutesy little chapel, and there's a small memorial to a family of 4, murdered by mysterious transients who were never caught. And they were all home one night when the sky broke in. Then he killed the entire family while they slept. Mom, dad, son, and daughter all dead within just a few minutes of each other. As you can probably guess, the murders absolutely devastated our small town. I was only in elementary school when it happened. But I can still remember the vigil, the funeral, and the ceremony that surrounded the unveiling of the chapel's memorial. It was a completely random, avoidable tragedy, an act of malice perpetrated on us by some shadowy outside evil. Only, that's not what actually happened. What really happened is like an open secret, something we all know, but no one ever says out loud. It's like that because we need to protect our community. At least that's what I was told, but I'm not sure how lying about it actually helps us. It's just a veneer, a phony facade of small-town tranquility. What's the point of pretending we're a quiet, happy town when the reality is far from it? Okay, I guess I've been blue-balling you all over what actually happened, so I'll just get right to it. On the night in question, the family had dinner, watched some TV. Then at some point after 9 p.m., the parents put their kids to bed. The dad usually stayed up with a glass of scotch after Mom and the kids went to bed. We'd watch football or baseball highlights, binge a few late-night shows, typical dad stuff. But he never got up off the couch that night. The whole cover story was that the family had been killed while they slept. And technically, that's true. But it's always painted like they were all sleeping peacefully in their beds when they were killed. But that's not true. A few hours before they were murdered, the family had sat down to dinner. I don't know what they ate exactly. Chicken pot pie or whatever. But I know what they had for dessert, because that day, the 9-year-old daughter of the family had made everyone some of that strawberry cream-flavored Jell-O pudding. The way I imagined it, it probably wasn't the nicest dessert they'd ever had. But geez, if my kid appeared to show a passion for cooking, baking, really anything, I'd feign enthusiasm and clear my plate. Who cares if they got the powder-to-milk ratio off by little or used a whole bunch of extra sugar when there's already a ton in there? Only. The reason that tasted off is because the 9-year-old girl had poured in a ton of NyQuil Max Strength into the pudding mix. Out, don't know exactly how much she put in there, or how much the parents and brother actually ate, but it was enough to pretty much knock them out so the daughter could put her little plan of hers into action. You see, the reason why they never caught the mysterious transient hobo murderer that chose to randomly break in and murder the family is because there never was one. After her family were all passed out, the little girl went into the kitchen and took a big old knife out of a drawer or a block. She then walked into the TV room where her dad was asleep on the couch and cut his throat. From what I was told, she cut his throat so deep and wide that he couldn't scream. All he could do was put his hands to the wound. Wonder why? But he would have been dead in mere minutes. After that, she went upstairs and did the same to her mother and brother, just opened them up right there in their beds. This all happened on a Friday night, by the way, and no one even suspected anything had happened until Sunday morning when none of the family showed up to church. But even then, they might have their reasons not to attend, could have been out of town visiting family, it'd be a spur-of-the-moment vacation. Besides, this is the kind of town where everyone knows each other's business. But they also know well enough to stay out of each other's business, if that makes any sense. The point is, no one visited this family's house until Monday afternoon, like 50-something hours after the murders had occurred. The kids hadn't shown up at school, the parents hadn't shown up at the jobs. And from what I understand, the cops basically spent the morning piecing together until they realized the whole family was missing. Obviously, the first place to check out was the house itself. So a couple of sheriff's deputies roll up to check in on them. What they found is pretty hotly disputed among our town's residents, and depending on who you talk to about it, one of three things happened. The first scenario is that the 9-year-old daughter had taken their own life after the gravity of what she did set in. After that, the whole thing was covered up just to avoid all the painful media attention a case like that might get. That's the simplest explanation. And I know Occam's razor tells us that's the one we should believe. But that's not what I think happened. I understand why people might want to cover it up having something terrible like that get out into the news with terrorists, small town like ours apart. But terrible crimes like that happen way more than we'd like to acknowledge. And the news always gets out. So what was so terrible about these murders? I mean, even worse than they already were, that made people actually keep quiet about it. Like even in my case, I think I might be the first person to tell an outsider this stuff, maybe ever. But even so, the culture of silence that seems to be like encoded into our DNA. It means I can't quite bring myself to give you the names, dates, or places. And that's because all the fallouts the media circus, maybe even the prison sentences handed out, they all be on my head. But anyway, back to the stuff I think might have happened. The first alternative theory is that when the cops broke in, the girl made like she was the lone survivor, tricked the cops into getting close to her, or then tried to attack them. The cops tried to safely detain her. But she had that same knife she'd used to kill her parents, and the chaos. One of them just shot her. At least that's what I think. Definitely the less inflammatory of the two alternative theories, but not the one that makes the most sense to me. I buy a trigger-happy rookie who just saw the knife and opted for self-preservation, but not being able to restrain a 9-year-old girl. Seriously, I don't know. No one who propagates that theory was anywhere near the family's house to be able to hear any gunshot and trigger happy new cop or not. I've refused to believe they wouldn't call for EMTs after they just shot a 9-year-old. Then once county EMTs are involved, the chance that a cover-up is long gone, because there's a whole bunch of paperwork involved. And then there's a second alternative theory, the one where the EMTs don't get called, because everyone's already dead when the cops enter the house. No one saw the 9-year-old daughter at any point that weekend, meaning she didn't leave the house to buy groceries, visit the diner, nothing like that. So what is she eating? And how did she die? According to some, the answer to both questions is pretty messed up. And the worst thing, the same answer. The 9-year-old died after attempting to eat the body of her dead father. She died because trying to eat her own dad made her sick enough to not be able to hold anything down, water included. I'm not a doctor, so I can't exactly say how that would actually kill a person, maybe dehydration. But by the time the cop kicked down the family's back door on that Monday afternoon, the little girl was dead, lying in a puddle of her own vomit and liquid feces. I know it's an awfully convenient coincidence that both officers who found the family retired and moved out of town shortly afterward, are the only two people who knew the truth, just packed up and left without leaving behind any means of reaching them. But at the same time, I can see why two young small-town cops just couldn't handle what they saw that day. I mean, if the second alternative theory really is to be believed, seeing something like that would be enough to drive you mad. As you can imagine, this isn't something I can really talk about with many people. Me and my high school friends used to talk about it every so often, but always in hushed tones, and never out in public where older folks might hear us. And now that my parents have passed, and I live well, someplace else, it's not like you can just roll back into town and start asking questions that will just put up that same wall of silence that I saw whenever anyone asks what happened. Darn tragedy, such as shame, hope they catch the guy one day, they'll say. Then one day when everyone who knows the truth is dead, the comforting lies they told about the murderers will become just another version of the truth. All that evil that found its way into the body of a 9-year-old girl will all just be forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what needs to happen. My family owns a log cabin down just outside of this one stoplight town called Marble, in North Carolina. It's kind of a family heirloom. One we're reluctant to get rid of since it's where our family originates from. And I think another reason we haven't sold it is that there's a very interesting story attached to this place. Well, interesting to the neutral observer, but it must have been pretty darn scary for my grandma, who was the one to actually live through it. So let's the summer of 1998, 2 years before I was even born, and my grandma's out of the cabin on her lonesome. My grandpa passed before it was born. But almost every summer they were together, my grandparents would go out to that cabin and just spend 2 weeks with nobody but squirrels for company. After Grandpa passed, she carried the tradition on as a way of dealing with the grief. And that's how she came to be there alone in like June or July of '98. Now, she didn't have a TV out there, but she did have an old radio she used to listen to her old radio plays on some now old defunct station. The station, like most others, used to take little breaks for news broadcasts, and one day, she hears about these bombs that have been going off in Georgia and Alabama. And the cops had a suspect they wanted to talk to, but he'd gone on the run and was possibly hiding out in the hills of his home state of, you guessed it, North Carolina. The news guy then gives a brief description of the suspect, which was on a no medium height, dark hair, lightish eyes, and says the guy's name is Eric Rudolph. My grandma used to say that the name stuck with her mainly because of the Christmas song about the reindeer, and she found herself whistling the thing even though it's bad luck in the middle of the summer. Anyways, a few hours go by, the sun goes down, and Grandma was just chilling in the cabin, doing whatever grandmas do. Then all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. Grandma wasn't expecting anyone. And the only neighbors she had were like a mile down the road. So it's with understandable trepidation that she got up and walked towards the cabin's front door. Upon opening it, she sees a guy of medium height, wearing a baseball cap, with lightish eyes and a dark mustache. Grandma, being the kindly soul that she was, wishes him a good evening and asked what she can do for him. "Good evening, ma'am." He says, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you a small favor." He goes on to ask my grandma if she has any food she can spare. His story being that he also owned a cabin in the area and had come out to visit his property. Only because he set off after work and forgot to pick up groceries for his cabin. He ended up being without food for the night. The way Grandma tells it. The guy was just so darn polite with her that she just like instinctually invited him inside without really thinking it through. She usually kept her pantry stocked with all kinds of dried and canned goods, so she always had something to spare. And she says filling up this guy's backpack with jerky and peaches when she looks up at him and stops. "I didn't catch your name," Grandma said. "My name is Bobby, ma'am." "Bobby, what?" Grandma asked. "Bobby Randolph." The guy replied. "Randolph." She said that name rang alarm bells in her mind. It wasn't quite Rudolph, but it was awful close enough for her to get this real bad feeling down in the pit of her stomach. And bearing in mind, this is way before cell phones. And the cabin didn't even have a landline connection to it. And the most effective form of outside communication Grandma had was a freaking flare gun. And her situation was as bad as she thought it was. A flare gun wasn't quite going to cut it. So instead, Grandma played along. She knew if she just played dumb and gave the guy some food and let them on his way, she could drive into the town first thing in the morning and tell the cops who had stopped by at the cabin. But then read it, she's about to politely ask him to move along. He says something like, "Actually, I got a small favor to ask. Do you have anywhere I can lay my head for the night?" My grandma always said there was like the stalemate moment, where she looked at Bobby, saw the wild desperation in his eyes, and tried her hardest to keep her cool. As she said, "I'm sorry, I just don't have a room to spare." Then Bobby reaches into his jacket, pulls out a pistol, and says something like, "I'm sorry. I was hoping you wouldn't say that." Then nods the gun and says they'll make me use this. And for those of you that haven't figured it out already, the guide or door wasn't Bobby Randolph, or whatever dumb fake name he'd given her. The man in her cabin was Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber himself. Grandma says it was one of the scariest experiences of her life, but not for the reasons you might think. You see, she said she was never afraid to die. She was in her mid-70s at the time, and I think she'd squared things away with God a long time prior. Instead, she said the scary thing was how weirdly normal this guy was. Even after the metaphorical mask came off. The guy remained polite and cordial with my grandma, and even offered to help out with chores and stuff in the morning. Obviously, she told him she was more than capable of looking after herself. And she definitely didn't want the FBI thinking she was okay with him staying there overnight. But even so, he wasn't anything like the unhinged maniac she had imagined after hearing the news report. My grandma used to say the only time he really gave a hint of who he was, or what he'd done, was when they said grace before they had dinner. She could never remember exactly what he said. Only that it was something about how the righteous will prevail. This was a guy who just tried to kill literally hundreds of people in a series of horrific bomb attacks. So I can understand why hearing him basically referring to himself as righteous really creeped her out. It creeps me out just thinking about having to eat dinner with him. I don't think I'd be able to eat a bite. So it might not come as a surprise to hear that Grandma barely touched her food. She barely slept that night either. She took the bed while Eric apparently took the floor, and the whole time she expected to suddenly hear rotor blades when some chopper-mounted spotlight lit up the house like it was Broadway. But nope. No FBI guy showed up, and she says she must have nodded off in the end because all of a sudden, it's light outside. And Eric is nowhere to be seen. She said she was so exhausted from that whole thing that for a second, she wandered around the cabin like, did I dream that? And then she finds this note on the countertop. One scribbled in pencil that just said, "Thank you, God bless." And she knew it had actually happened. I know this isn't your typical scary story, because despite having to share her cabin with a verified monster, I don't think my grandma was in any serious danger. Maybe if she tried to call the cops or something, maybe if she forced his hand, that maybe he didn't actually hurt her. But she was old. She was no actual threat to him and he knew well that the cabin had no phone line and nothing like that. Or he wouldn't have showed up there in the first place. She even said it herself. She wasn't scared to die. She just sort of knew he wasn't about to hurt her. But like her, the thing that creeps me out and my sister out about Grandma's close encounter is how normal the guy seemed. We like to imagine that terrorists and people like them are these vile, evil soulless monsters that just stew in their own hate all day. And maybe that's true for some of them. But the idea that the evil list of us are just like us, that would really scares me.